Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video it's just going to be a bit of a vlog based on something I've just seen, which I have to say I cannot believe, which is Boris Johnson's latest scheme to solve the Irish problem with the backstop. Before I get into that, if you find yourself enjoying the video, then please click the like button and subscribe to the channel. So, I saw this relayed in the Sun newspaper. Now, for those who don't know, this is one of our most obnoxious newspapers. In fact, it is a newspaper so obnoxious that some years ago it did something so awful that it is basically now persona non grata in the city of Liverpool. Apparently you can get it here and there, but it's a brown paper job behind the counter type thing. But they were relaying this plan of Boris Johnson. Now, from Boris Johnson's point of view, let's try and be reasonably fair to him, as fair as we dare. He has an issue. He wants to leave the EU, or whether he does or doesn't is irrelevant. His party does. He believes his party will split. He believes his political career can go nowhere unless we leave the EU. Right, so we need to leave with a deal. The problem is that the deal has to make sure that the Good Friday Agreement is adhered to. That basically means you need an open border within Ireland. That effectively means free movement of goods and people and leprechauns and everything between the EU, Republic of Ireland, and the UK outside of the EU, Northern Ireland. So how do you accomplish this? Well, we've got the withdrawal agreement, it's got the backstop in place, which says for the transition period, we're going to have this regulatory alignment. And then at the end of that transition period, once we've actually properly left the EU, we have something in place to ensure that that border remains open. If we don't have anything in place, then the backstop remains in place, which ties in, it's basically a customs union to make sure that we've got that regulatory alignment throughout the island of Ireland. But what's more important is, that border remains open. Now, problem, he can't get that through Parliament. Why can't he get it through Parliament? The opposition parties are going to mostly vote against it anyway, just because the form of Brexit is a Tory Brexit. Some will be doing it because they genuinely don't want this to happen. Some are doing it just for party political reasons. Really doesn't matter. The opposition parties are by and large not going to vote for it. So you need Conservative MPs to vote for it, in which case it'll go through. Problem is that there's some Conservative MPs that do not want a deal at all. There are other ones who don't want Brexit at all. But even some of those have voted for it, but some of them do not want a deal at all. So they pick on the backstop. They've got no issue with the backstop. They just don't want the deal. So they pick on something. So he can't get it through Parliament. Doesn't matter what he does. He cannot get a deal through Parliament. He doesn't want to leave with no deal, or that being said, he doesn't want the blame for leaving with no deal. So he looks for some people to blame. Now, in that vein, he's already attacked the EU for not negotiating with him, even though they haven't refused to negotiate with him. They've just told him that the withdrawal agreement is locked, which it is. And that was agreed by the UK government as well. And then in his letter with Donald Tusk, he was basically saying, look, I can't get it through Parliament, therefore the backstop has to be dropped. But the EU comes back with, well, we can't get a non-backstop through our Parliament, so the backstop has to stay. I mean, it's one of those things. So, but it's effectively a blame game, isn't it? First of all, he's blaming the EU for the no-deal Brexit that he is intending to cause. And he, first of all, as I say, blames the EU for not talking when they haven't refused to talk. Then he blames them for the backstop, when actually the backstop was EU. I was just asked on Twitter, actually. He says, you can't really find out whose idea was the backstop. It was actually the UK's idea. Now, it's not that the EU were fine with the withdrawal agreement without a backstop. We put the backstop and they oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, we're keeping that. That's not how it worked out. The EU insisted on something that kept the border within Ireland open, just as we should be insisting on that. And in fact, to be fair to Theresa May, she insisted on that anyway. So the backstop was the UK's idea for it. We don't, as I was saying in the tweet, I don't know what the private discussions went. I can't possibly know that. But what I do know is it wasn't the EU's preferred solution. The EU's preferred solution was a permanent customs union, something which, by the way, Labour committed to. And if the Tories had put that in, maybe they'd have been bounced into supporting the withdrawal agreement. But they went, no, we don't want a permanent customs union. how about this as an idea? You know, the backstop. All right, the EU went, that's fine. That also keeps it open. So it was effectively our idea. The alternative is a proper customs union that would be there for good, which would be great. No. So his next tack now, and I cannot believe this, is to basically blame Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. So how is he doing this? He's come up with this grand idea, relayed through the Sun newspaper, possibly some others as well. I haven't read. I suppose it'd be the sort of thing that the Daily Mail would push as well. I haven't actually checked them out yet. And it is this. He says, well, here's the problem as I see it, says Boris Johnson. We don't want the backstop, that can't get through Parliament. Now, here's the issue. In order to keep that border open, what we need is regulatory alignment in both parts of Ireland, yeah? Yeah. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're not going to maintain alignment with the EU. That's not on the cards. We are diverging as soon as we leave. He said that. He said that in his letter even. So here's an idea. Why don't you, the Republic of Ireland, diverge from the EU? What? What? Bear in mind, this divergence of standards from the EU that Boris Johnson is talking about is once we've left the EU. We can't do it now because we're a member of the EU. We have to have aligned standards. That's what being a member of the EU is principally about. And Ireland are a member of the EU and intend to remain a member of the EU. In fact, Northern Ireland wanted to remain a member of the EU. Now, what he's saying is you need to divert, and he's saying this as if it's all perfectly reasonable. Well, if you match our standards, so the UK government gets to diverge from the EU, it gets to change whatever standards it's like, the Republic of Ireland, like a good little boy, has to follow suit and do whatever the UK government does, diverging from the EU, which of course it can't do because it's a member of the EU. So what Boris Johnson is basically saying is, actually, this whole problem can be solved if the Republic of Ireland leaves the EU as well. I mean, perfect solution, isn't it? Oh, and by the way, don't just leave the EU. You basically tie yourself to the UK government standards. Whenever the UK government, well, UK Parliament has to vote these things through, of course, decides to change a particular standard, let's say, you know, food standards, so we can get that US deal, or, you know, environmental standards, or standards, you know, for workers' rights, anything like that, you have to change yours as well to match ours. I mean, I'll tell you the problem I have with this. Obviously, it's mad, it can't happen. That's obvious. I say it's obvious. Some people don't actually see that for some reason. But what really annoys me about this, it's a bit like the Priti Patel freedom of movement thing that I talked about last night. Parliament will never allow it. But just saying it is a problem. You know, this is the UK telling Ireland what to do. Basically saying you need to become a vassal state of Britain. Saying that to anyone is appalling, appalling arrogance. Saying it to Ireland in particular is potentially explosive. And this is my concern. At some point, this Brexit nonsense will have to be over, one way or the other, and we'll have to be back on the path. This may happen next year, it may not happen for 20 years. At some point, it's got to happen. At some point, we've got to re-engage with the world, with our allies, our neighbours, the people with whom we can actually have good relationships, not abusive partners elsewhere in the world. And this will come back to haunt us. This will be the thing. I mean, there's an awful lot of rubbish talked about Britain all the time by countries. Go, oh, Britain's been evil, blah, blah, blah. Absolute, you know, everyone forgetting the role of their own so-called country in various world historical events as well. But this would be the here and now. This isn't some ancient history. This is the UK government behaving like it now. And I know there's a certain thing about, you know, oh, Boris Johnson doesn't represent me. It's a bit like, you know, they're not my president in America. Yeah, he is. Donald Trump, if you're in America, is your president. He does represent you. I know he doesn't represent your interests, but he represents you. Boris Johnson represents the UK at home and abroad. He is the Prime Minister. It's as simple as that. Doesn't have to be. MPs could have, you know, Jeremy Corbyn could have issued his vote of no confidence before summer. I mean, maybe that would have lost. Doesn't matter. It's worth trying out. It was not at all clear that Boris Johnson actually had the confidence of the House. Who knows? They didn't take the opportunity to do that, so he's now the Prime Minister. He represents us, and that's all there is to it. When he says something, that's government policy. Whether he can do it or not is another matter, because Parliament's there to stop him. But he can still say it, and it becomes official government policy, which means official UK policy. And this will bite us on the arse later on. Later on, you know, people will be able to say, well, Britain said this, and it will be true. We did. And I can only apologise. But as I say, I feel on this occasion rather worse. It's actually not going to be the first time this week I'll be apologising to Ireland for something we're doing. But it is going to affect us worse in the UK, because this has now been said. All these things that have been said at the moment, which would not have been said if Parliament had have prevented Boris Johnson from ever becoming Prime Minister. Winning the leadership election for the party had no bearing on him becoming Prime Minister. They could have stopped him. They should have stopped him. They knew what he was going to do. They shouldn't. All this was, although some of the things are particularly, this was surprising even to me. At the same time, when you think about it, do you think to yourself, is it really that surprising? And you think to yourself, well, I didn't think about it, but actually, no, it's not that surprising, is it? And he's going to say more outrageous things. There's still 2 more bloody weeks till Parliament's sitting. Week and a half, whatever. I mean, goodness knows what he's going to be saying. He's ramping it up. I mean, he's ramping it up at the moment. We've already had Britain's name dragged through the mud through this Brexit process, and that was under Theresa May, who was at least adhering to international agreements. Boris Johnson is running roughshod over everything. And I cannot imagine what the reaction to this news would be in Ireland, in any part of Ireland. But, you know, we all know what the reason is. He's not saying it because he thinks it's a good idea or that it would be taken on board. He's saying it because he wants to say to his supporters, these arrogant little Englanders, that, you know, well, I've come up with this solution. So if I'm coming up with all these solutions. They could just remove the backstop. We don't need it. Or, you know, Ireland could just diverge if they're so keen on it. You know, all these things as if they're perfectly reasonable. And it's all just intended so that when Parliament stops him, and they will stop him, these things he's talking about doing will not happen. But when they stop him, he can get to say to his supporters, well, I would have done it and it would have all been fine. And you will never prove otherwise to them without, you know, even if this no deal Brexit happens, you know, some of those supporters will still go with Boris Johnson's view that, well, we could have had a deal if only they'd have done this, as if it's perfectly reasonable. That's why he's saying it. But it's damaging to the country, and it's damaging to relationships with our closest neighbours. Yeah. So there it is. That's what he's saying. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I think I can probably guess. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to support the channel further, then please click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.